There comes a moment, quiet, uncomfortable, undeniable, when the avoidant finally understands, not when the super empath is pleading, not when they are explaining, not even when they are loving harder. It happens when the room is silent, when the phone no longer lights up, when the person who once felt available beyond reason is suddenly unavailable. And in that stillness, the avoidant feels something unfamiliar, loss, because what they mistook for endless patience was actually emotional mastery. What they assumed would always be there was a choice, not an obligation. You see, the super empath doesn't love recklessly. They love consciously. They see deeply, feel fully, and give intentionally. But here's the part most people miss. They also know when to stop. The avoidant thought space was power, thought control was safety, thought that staying just out of reach kept them in charge. But real power was never in pulling away. It was in showing up. And the super empath knew that. They didn't walk away because they stopped caring. They walked away because they finally started honoring themselves. And that's when the realization hits the avoidant hardest. Because the empath didn't leave in anger. They didn't leave in chaos. They left in clarity. They left aligned. The avoidant finally understands that what they had wasn't pressure. It was presence. It wasn't demand. It was devotion. It wasn't neediness. It was emotional generosity. And now, the distance they once used as armor feels like a prison. Here's the deeper lesson in this moment. Love isn't proven by how much someone tolerates. It's proven by how much someone chooses again and again. The super empath chose connection. The avoidant chose protection. And protection always feels wise, until it costs you what mattered most. This moment isn't punishment, it's revelation. Because growth begins when fear is exposed for what it is, not strength, but avoidance of truth. The super empath didn't lose anything. They gained themselves, and the avoidant, they gained awareness, late but valuable, because understanding, even delayed, is still an invitation. An invitation to stop running, to stop hiding, to stop mistaking emotional distance for self-respect, and to finally realize this timeless principle. The people who love deeply are not weak. They are rare. And once they choose themselves, they don't come back the same. They come back stronger, or they don't come back at all. And that is the moment everything changes. The avoidant reaches a moment of clarity that doesn't arrive through logic, arguments, or persuasion. It arrives through feeling, through the quiet collapse of a belief they carried for years, the belief that distance made them strong. For the longest time, they equated emotional withdrawal with control. Stepping back felt like power. Keeping feelings unspoken felt like safety. Not needing anyone felt like independence. But what they were really doing was protecting themselves from vulnerability, not mastering it. Avoidance often begins as self-preservation. Somewhere in the past, opening up led to disappointment, rejection, or emotional overwhelm. So the nervous system learned a shortcut. If closeness hurts, create space. If emotions feel heavy, detach. If someone needs more, retreat. Over time, this strategy starts to look like confidence. The avoidant tells themselves they are self-sufficient, unbothered, above emotional dependency. They pride themselves on staying calm, rational, and unaffected. But beneath that calm is not certainty. It is fear carefully disguised. The super empath senses this long before it is ever spoken. They feel the tension between what is said and what is avoided. They notice how connection deepens and then suddenly pulls back. They experience warmth followed by distance, and because they understand emotional language, they often interpret this withdrawal as something they need to fix. They offer patience, reassurance, understanding, not because they are weak, but because they see the wound behind the behavior. The avoidant misreads this patience as permanence. They assume the empath will always adapt, always wait, always understand. And so distance becomes habitual. It becomes the default response to discomfort. Every time closeness threatens to expose vulnerability, the avoidant steps back and tells themselves they are being wise. But wisdom isn't avoidance. It's courage with awareness. The realization begins when the empath stops chasing clarity and starts choosing peace. When their energy shifts, when they no longer explain, justify, or try to bridge the emotional gap alone. Suddenly, the space the avoidant once controlled feels different. It's no longer something they created. It's something they are left inside. And that's when the truth becomes unavoidable. Distance was never strength. Strength would have been staying present through discomfort. Strength would have been admitting fear instead of masking it as independence. Strength would have been saying, "This scares me," instead of silently pulling away. What the avoidant called freedom was actually emotional isolation. What they called boundaries were often walls. What they called calm was emotional numbness. And now, in the absence of the empath's warmth, the avoidant feels the full weight of what distance really costs. Vulnerability is not exposure without protection. It is honesty with oneself. The avoidant avoided not because they lacked care, but because caring felt dangerous. And yet, in avoiding vulnerability, they avoided intimacy, growth, and genuine connection. They postponed pain, but they also postponed love. This moment of understanding doesn't come with fireworks. It comes with stillness, with the quiet recognition that the person who once made emotional space feel safe is no longer there to soften the emptiness. And in that stillness, the Avoidant finally sees that protection is not the same as healing. Distance kept them safe from being hurt, but it also kept them from being known. And being known, truly seen without running, that is where real strength has always lived. The avoidant once believed that the super empath's love was excessive, emotional, maybe even overwhelming. It was easy to label it as neediness, as if depth itself were a flaw. From the outside, the empath's consistency, attentiveness, and willingness to lean in felt like pressure. But with time and reflection, a different truth begins to surface. That love was never impulsive or desperate. It was intentional. It was chosen. The super empath does not give because they fear being alone. They give because they understand connection. They know that love is not something that survives on instinct alone. It requires presence, effort, and care. Every message sent, every check-in, every moment of emotional availability was not an accident. It was a deliberate act of engagement. The empath was not trying to fill a void. They were offering partnership. The avoidant, uncomfortable with intensity, often misinterprets intention as expectation. When someone shows up emotionally, it can feel like a demand to reciprocate at the same depth. And rather than admit, "I don't know how to meet you here," the avoidant quietly reframes the story. They tell themselves the empath is asking for too much, feeling too much, caring too much. This reframing protects the avoidant from confronting their own emotional limits. But time has a way of correcting false narratives. When the empath steps back, the avoidant begins to replay moments they once dismissed. The thoughtfulness, the patience, the way the empath adjusted their language to make connection easier, the way they celebrated the avoidant's small openings instead of criticizing their distance. None of that was chaotic. None of that was careless. It was precise. It was conscious. It was love expressed through understanding rather than impulse. Desperation chases reassurance. Intentional love offers safety. The empath did not hover to control. They remained present to create emotional security. They listened not to fix, but to know. They stayed not because they were afraid to leave, but because they believed in the potential of the connection. And belief, when grounded, is not weakness. It is faith in growth. The avoidant begins to see that the empath's love had boundaries all along. They just weren't enforced loudly. The empath gave space when needed, even when it was uncomfortable. They adapted, but they did not abandon themselves immediately. What looked like endless tolerance was actually grace extended with awareness, and grace, when misunderstood, often gets taken for granted. Intentional love doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand applause. It simply shows up consistently, and when it finally withdraws, it does so with clarity, not chaos. That is the moment the avoidant realizes the empath wasn't clinging, they were choosing, and choice can change. The ache that follows is not just missing the person, it is missing the way they loved, the feeling of being seen without being chased, of being accepted without being enabled, of being held emotionally without being controlled. That kind of love doesn't come from insecurity, it comes from emotional maturity. The avoidant now understands that what they once labeled as too much was actually the standard. The empath's love wasn't asking to be carried, it was inviting reciprocity. It wasn't loud because it was fragile, it was steady because it was rooted. And realizing that too late doesn't make it untrue, it simply makes it unforgettable. For a long time, the avoidant believed that control was the key to emotional safety. Control over time, control over access, control over how much they revealed and when. If they could regulate closeness, they could regulate risk. Emotional distance felt like a lever they could pull whenever things became uncomfortable. And because this strategy often kept them from immediate pain, it reinforced the belief that control equaled security. But emotional safety is not built through regulation of others, it is built through regulation of self. And this is where the misunderstanding begins to unravel. The super empath never tried to control the avoidance feelings. They didn't demand constant reassurance or force emotional conversations. What they offered instead was consistency, predictable presence, emotional availability, and reliability. At first, this kind of steadiness can feel threatening to an avoidant. There is nowhere to hide behind chaos, no highs and lows to distract from vulnerability, just a calm invitation to be real. Control creates compliance, not connection. Emotional safety creates trust, and trust cannot exist where one person is always managing distance to avoid discomfort. The avoidant begins to not ice the difference only after safety is gone. When the empath steps back, the avoidant feels exposed in a way they never anticipated, not because they are being pursued, but because no one is holding the emotional space anymore. The silence isn't peaceful, it's hollow, and for the first time, control feels cold rather than empowering. The empath's presence once acted as an anchor. They didn't fix the avoidant's emotions, but they made them feel less overwhelming by being willing to sit with them. Emotional safety is the freedom to experience feelings without fear of abandonment or judgment. It is knowing that someone can witness your uncertainty without using it against you. The empath provided that, not through pressure, but through acceptance. Control, on the other hand, keeps emotions at arm's length. It avoids exposure, but it also avoids intimacy. When you control connection, you never fully relax inside it. You are always calculating when to pull away, how much to share, how not to need. That constant self-monitoring is exhausting, even if it feels familiar. The avoidant begins to see that safety doesn't come from being untouchable. It comes from being understood, and being understood requires openness. The empath never asked for perfection. They asked for presence. They didn't need grand declarations. They valued honesty in small moments. That was the safety the avoidant didn't know how to receive. When safety was available, the avoidant reached for control. When control is all that remains, safety becomes the absence they can finally feel. Emotional safety allows growth. Control preserves the status quo. The empath created a space where vulnerability could evolve into strength, where fear could soften through connection rather than be buried under distance. And now, in reflection, the avoidant recognizes that what they once saw as pressure was actually permission to feel without performing, to connect without losing oneself. This realization is subtle but profound. It reshapes the definition of power. True power is not the ability to withdraw at will. It is the ability to stay present when withdrawal feels easier. Emotional safety is not something you enforce, it is something you co-create. And once it is gone, no amount of control can replace the warmth of being emotionally at home with another human being. The avoidant was often drawn to moments of intensity, the sparks, the rush, the sudden closeness that felt exciting but not demanding. Intensity had a beginning and an end. It could be entered and exited without explanation. It didn't require maintenance. It didn't ask for endurance. And because of that, it felt manageable. Intensity could be experienced without surrender. Consistency, however, is different. Consistency does not overwhelm the senses. It challenges the patterns. It requires showing up even when the emotions are flat, even when nothing dramatic is happening. For the avoidant, this can feel strangely unsettling. Without emotional spikes or dramatic distance, there is nowhere to hide. Consistency asks a quiet but persistent question: can you stay? The super empath understood this instinctively. They knew that real connection is not built in emotional peaks, but in steady presence. It's built in the ordinary moments, the check-ins that don't demand urgency, the reliability that doesn't need to be proven loudly, the emotional availability that doesn't disappear when things become uncomfortable. This kind of presence doesn't create fireworks, it creates foundations. The avoidant often confused intensity for chemistry. They believed that if something didn't feel charged or urgent, it must not be meaningful. But intensity is often driven by uncertainty, by the push and pull that activates anxiety and desire. It feels alive because it is unstable. Consistency feels calmer, and calm can be mistaken for boredom when chaos is familiar. The empath offered steadiness, not as a performance, but as a value. They showed up the same way on good days and difficult ones. They communicated openly rather than dramatically. They didn't disappear to create longing. They trusted that connection deepens through repetition, not shock. And because of that, their presence was predictable in the best possible way. At first, the avoidant didn't know what to do with this. Without the adrenaline of emotional swings, they felt exposed. Consistency doesn't allow you to hide behind excuses or timing. It invites accountability. It asks you to be emotionally present even when you'd rather retreat. And that level of presence can feel more demanding than intensity ever was. Only in hindsight does the avoidant begin to understand what consistency was offering. Intensity fades quickly. It burns bright and then burns out. Consistency builds slowly, but it endures. The moments of excitement are fleeting, but the feeling of being emotionally held, that grows. The empath wasn't trying to keep the avoidant entertained. They were trying to build something sustainable. When the empath steps away, the avoidant starts to notice the absence in a new way. Not the loss of excitement, but the loss of stability. There is no one checking in without agenda. No one holding emotional continuity. No one bridging the gaps when communication falters. And suddenly intensity feels empty without consistency to support it. Consistency creates trust, and trust creates safety. Safety allows vulnerability, and vulnerability allows real intimacy. The avoidant begins to see that the deepest connections are not loud. They are steady. They are formed through repeated acts of care that don't ask to be noticed. What once felt ordinary now feels irreplaceable. The avoidant realizes that consistency wasn't a lack of passion. It was devotion expressed through reliability. It wasn't boring. It was grounding. And while intensity can spark attraction, only consistency can sustain connection over time. For a long time, the avoidant framed the empath's departure as abandonment. It fit the narrative that closeness eventually leads to loss, that people leave when things get hard, that relying on connection is dangerous. This interpretation was comforting in its own way because it removed responsibility. If the empath abandoned, then the avoidant was simply a victim of circumstance rather than a participant in the dynamic. But with distance and reflection, that story begins to crack. The super empath did not leave suddenly or carelessly. They didn't disappear in anger or withdraw to punish. Their leaving was gradual, internal, and deeply considered. Long before they physically stepped back, they emotionally recalibrated. They asked themselves difficult questions. They noticed how often they were adjusting, waiting, understanding, and softening while their own needs remained unmet. What looked like abandonment from the outside was actually the result of long internal work. The empath evolved. They learned that love does not require self-erasure, that compassion without reciprocity becomes self-neglect, that understanding someone's wounds does not obligate them to bleed in silence. Growth didn't harden them, it clarified them. They stopped confusing patience with endurance and empathy with obligation. The avoidant begins to realize that abandonment is impulsive. Evolution is intentional. The empath didn't leave because they stopped caring. They left because they started caring about themselves in a way that I hadn't before. They recognized that staying in a dynamic where emotional effort flowed in one direction was slowly dimming their own light, and honoring that truth required courage. The empath's withdrawal was quiet because it wasn't reactive. There was no dramatic exit, no final argument designed to assign blame. There was simply a shift in energy, less explaining, less reaching, more boundaries, more self-respect. The avoidant didn't feel attacked, they felt confused, and confusion often feels like abandonment when control is lost. As time passes, the avoidant notices something else. The empath is not broken by leaving. They are not spiraling or seeking replacement. They are grounded, calmer, more whole. That reality challenges the avoidant's assumptions. If the empath had abandoned out of fear or instability, they would be restless. Instead, they are rooted. This is where the understanding deepens. The empath didn't walk away to escape pain. They walked away to stop repeating it. They chose growth over familiarity. They chose alignment over attachment. And that choice required more strength than staying ever did. The avoidant begins to see that abandonment is about avoidance of responsibility. Evolution is about ownership. The empath owned their limits, owned their worth, owned the truth that love should not feel like constant emotional labor performed alone. And in that ownership, they transformed. What hurts the avoidant most is not the loss itself, but the realization that the empath's departure was not a failure of love. It was a success of self-awareness. The empath didn't leave because they were unable to connect. They left because they finally understood what connection should feel like. This reframing shifts everything. The avoidant can no longer dismiss the loss as bad timing or emotional fragility. They must face the possibility that the relationship ended not because love was impossible, but because growth was uneven. The empath didn't abandon, they evolved, and evolution changes what and who you can stay with. The avoidant often lives by a quiet rule. If pain is delayed, it is diminished. If emotions are kept at a distance, their impact can be managed. Avoidance becomes a strategy not to eliminate pain, but to postpone it. In the moment, this strategy feels effective. Conflict is sidestepped. Vulnerability is postponed. Emotional discomfort is pushed into the future, and because the consequences are not immediate, avoidance can masquerade as wisdom, but time is not a healer when truth is ignored. The super empath feels the weight of this delay long before the avoidant does. They experience the subtle erosion that happens when needs go unspoken and emotions remain unresolved. Each moment of emotional withdrawal creates a small fracture in connection, not dramatic enough to demand confrontation, but significant enough to weaken the foundation. The empath often carries the emotional cost up front, hoping that patience will eventually lead to openness. Avoidance does not cancel pain, it relocates it. The discomfort that could have been processed together is stored in silence. Unexpressed feelings accumulate. Unmet needs harden into quiet grief. And while the avoidant feels temporarily relieved, the emotional debt continues to grow. When the empath finally steps away, the pain that arrives for the avoidant feels sudden and overwhelming. It seems disproportionate, as if the loss came out of nowhere. But in truth, it is the compounded result of everything that was postponed. The conversations that never happened, the vulnerabilities that were never shared, the moments of closeness that were interrupted by distance. The avoidant begins to see that, had they faced discomfort earlier, the pain would have been smaller, more manageable, and shared. Growth would have been incremental. Instead, by avoiding short-term discomfort, they invited long-term loss. The price of avoidance is not paid immediately, it is paid in accumulation. The empath, on the other hand, processed pain as it came. They felt deeply, reflected honestly, and adjusted consciously. Their pain was not ignored, it was integrated. That is why, when they leave, they appear more at peace than expected. They already grieved while they stayed. They already confronted the truth internally. What looks like sudden strength is actually the result of long emotional labor. This contrast unsettles the avoidant. They wonder how the empath can move forward with such clarity while they themselves feel stuck in regret. The answer lies in timing. The empath faced pain early. The avoidant deferred it. And deferred pain does not disappear, it waits. Avoidance creates an illusion of stability. It keeps emotions calm on the surface while turbulence builds underneath. When the structure finally gives way, the collapse feels catastrophic. What could have been resolved through vulnerability now demands acceptance of loss. The avoidant starts to understand that courage is not the absence of fear, it is the willingness to meet fear while it is still small. Avoidance magnifies fear by allowing it to grow unchecked. Each avoided moment becomes another reason to stay distant. Each delayed truth makes the next truth harder to face. Pain is inevitable in connection. The choice is not whether to feel it, but when and how. The empath chose to feel it in real time through honesty and emotional engagement. The avoidant chose to delay it through distance and control, and now the delayed pain arrives without the comfort of shared understanding. This realization reframes everything. Avoidance did not protect the avoidant from hurt. It only ensured that when hurt came, it would come alone. For most of their life, the avoidant believed power meant independence, not needing anyone, not relying on emotional closeness, being able to walk away without looking back. Power was defined as self-containment, the ability to remain untouched by another person's emotions. And in a world that often equates strength with self-sufficiency, this belief felt justified. But there is a quieter, deeper form of power that reveals itself only through loss. The super empath understood something the avoidant had not yet learned. Connection is not the opposite of strength. It is the refinement of it. Choosing connection requires discernment, courage, and presence. It means allowing another person to matter without guaranteeing the outcome. It means risking disappointment in exchange for meaning. That kind of choice is not weakness. It is mastery over fear. Avoidance feels powerful because it offers control. You decide when to engage, when to retreat, when to feel. But control is a limited form of power. It can manage exposure, but it cannot create intimacy. It can prevent vulnerability, but it cannot produce fulfillment. Control keeps you safe, but it also keeps you small. The avoidant begins to realize that every time they chose distance, they also chose loneliness. Not immediately, but eventually, each moment of emotional withdrawal reinforced the belief that closeness was dangerous. And yet, the cost of that belief was paid in missed connection, unrealized depth, and relationships that never fully bloomed. The empath chose differently. They chose presence over protection. They leaned in when it would have been easier to pull away. They spoke when silence would have been safer. They opened when closing off would have preserved comfort. And in doing so, they expanded rather than contracted. True power is not the ability to avoid pain. It is the capacity to remain open in its presence. The empath did not guarantee themselves happiness by choosing connection. They guaranteed themselves authenticity. They lived in alignment with their values rather than in fear of outcomes. That alignment became their strength. When the empath leaves, the avoidant is left with a stark contrast. One person grew through connection, the other remained guarded through control. One risked and evolved, the other protected and stagnated. And this realization stings because it reveals a truth that cannot be argued away. Distance did not make the avoidant strong. It kept them unchanged. Connection requires responsibility. When you let someone matter, you must face your patterns. You must confront your fears. You must communicate rather than disappear. That accountability can feel threatening, but it is also transformative. It shapes character. It deepens self-awareness. It demands growth. The avoidant sees now that the empath's strength was never loud. It didn't dominate or withdraw to prove a point. It endured. It adapted. It chose integrity over control. And when staying meant self-betrayal, it had the strength to leave without resentment. Choosing connection does not mean clinging to people who cannot meet you. It means being brave enough to show up fully where there is potential and brave enough to walk away when there is not. That discernment is power refined through wisdom. The avoidant is left with an invitation rather than a condemnation to redefine strength, to understand that the deepest power is not found in walls, but in bridges, not in distance, but in the courage to be seen. Thank you for listening with an open heart and allowing these words to meet you where you are. Goodbye for now. May you carry this insight forward and choose connection with courage and clarity.